But what needs to happen is really a sense of awakening in the Ukrainian leadership that, in fact, the West, while declaring publicly to be fully committed to Ukraine, is in fact not. And they simply need to turn around and look at the past year and a half of actual support, the kind of support that the West has provided, to convince themselves that the West is not pursuing Ukraine's interest in this war, but only its own craven interests.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another program with the one and only Nicolai Petro, our top expert on political issues in Ukraine and Russia. Nicolai is a professor of political science at the University of Rhode Island and has published the wonderful work, The Tragedy of Ukraine, What Classical Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict. But today we want to discuss one of his latest publications entitled To End the War in Ukraine, Expose Its Core Lies. We just recently published that essay in an audio format, so listen to that one first if you haven't done so yet. Nicolai, thank you very much for joining me again.
Nice to be with you again, Pascal.
Nicolai, in your essay, in which you really lay out one of the fundamental problems of the entire war, which is this completely false narrative about Russia's war aims, you are describing that the narrative not only changed over time, that it started with, oh, Russia is very weak, but it wants to invade. And then when it invaded, it was like the fact that Russia didn't go all the way to Kiev was turned against it and used by NATO. But you're also alluding actually to this false choice that now is being created about either we send in NATO troops or Ukraine will be lost. And the West has been branding this conflict as an existential one. Why do you think it is that Western strategists have been attributing all of this evil and malice to Russia when the realist strategists like you and Ms. Merzheimer and others actually all have said, no, Russia doesn't actually want to invade, and we've got a lot of indications which you enumerate in your essay?
Well, the first reason this demonization came up was, as I point out in the essay, to rally support around a policy of extensive sanctions. And these sanctions, which currently number over 18,000, were meant in short order to devastate the Russian economy and to lead to the end of the war. Subsequently, when this did not happen, the narrative became reinforced because now the West is simply too far in to having committed to the defeat of Russia to withdraw in any way that allows it to save face. And therefore, it has become an existential struggle, in my opinion. Existential for the West, however, and for Ukraine, much less so for Russia.
Something that drives me nuts is the way that in the Western media, historical narratives are told in a way that not only makes no sense, but sometimes are just outright lies. I mean, one of the things that's conveniently forgotten, and in your essay you write about that, is that Russia didn't annex these territories until quite late into the actual fighting, and even more, Russia until 2022 never actually recognized the independence of the two Donbas republics. I mean, it was part and parcel of the Minsk agreement that these would be autonomous regions of Ukraine, and Russia kept to that. And there was such a very clear signal for 7 long years that Russia does not want these territories. It wants this place to be stable and safe and fine and not to be a spear tip against it, right? But these facts are being omitted, and then other like just untruths are being created about what Putin also said, because the Russian state says a lot of things, and one of the most popular people in the West is Mr. Medvedev, because Medvedev says very outrageous things. But he is not actually in power anymore. he's the deputy head of the Security Council and has no actual real power. And he's being quoted all the time and again. And whenever official Russians speak, that's just being all ignored in order to create this stupid narrative about the evil Russia. Can you explain to yourself why it is that it is possible to just exclude all of these heaps and mountains of facts, and then creates this war narrative in the West?
Well, a war narrative throughout history has never required any special justification. The fact that the conflict is ongoing suffices to provide the rationale for demonizing one's opponent. For anyone interested, simply go back to World War I and World War II posters and convince yourself of that. The point you made about the contrast between Medvedev and Putin is an interesting one, and it's one I've thought about. And I think from a diplomatic perspective, it makes a lot of sense. In other words, one of the problems with Western policy since the war has begun is that there has been an attempt to ram all the different participants on the NATO side into one narrative, and to prevent any kind of diversity that might allow for a fruitful discussion of alternative options that could lead to peace. And as a result, the thinking in the West on how to resolve this crisis has become incredibly narrow and unproductive. What we see by contrast in the case of Medvedev on the one hand and Putin on the other in Russia is that they are playing the diplomatic game in a more traditional historical manner. For example, Putin is the ultimate decider as commander-in-chief, and his decisions and words hold the most weight. Meanwhile, however, junior figures who nevertheless are known to interact with Putin and to be close to him float certain ideas, including potential threats that send clear signals to the West that if you go further, then we will respond in this way. Don't go to this extreme, because then we will respond this way. And this is actually, having this diversity in public pronouncements is actually very beneficial to diplomacy and to the conduct of foreign policy. And it's one of the catastrophes of the West that we have lost the ability to both understand and implement this sort of nuances in our dialogues.
This is a wonderful observation, because also if you look at the way that the Russians behave themselves and the language that they choose in official diplomatic settings. There was last week on Monday, there was a Security Council meeting which Russia called for to discuss Ukraine again. They do that again and again and again. And last week, it was even Mr. Lavrov going to New York himself and presenting his case. And he was very calm and step by step. And he was also talking about the participation of French mercenaries and the fact that Russia now killed a lot of them in a hotel, and how he is worried about the entire dynamic. And he even said that now the US is forced to reckon with the fact that a lot of its weapons are not actually going to the battlefield, but the black market, and that now US investigators are going to Ukraine to figure that out. And he actually wished them luck. He said, I wish you luck with this, because Lavrov understands how incredibly dangerous the situation is. Now, the Russians are able to have that kind of very sophisticated diplomacy, also what you alluded to. The West seems to have lost that completely. And I am very afraid it has to do with the fact that the US, but also Europe, that power is not concentrated. Nobody like really has a lot of power in order to shape what's going on. So I feel that the West is somewhat flying blind. Do you share that view, or where do you think this is a strategy by NATO still at this point, or is it more the outgrowth of everybody trying to coordinate and not being able to?
The leader of the Western Alliance and NATO is the United States. The United States, however, particularly as a result of the conflicts in the political establishment that are emerging in the context of the upcoming election in this fall, presidential and congressional elections, has become paralyzed. A lot of Western and American political analysts understand that this paralysis is a problem. But there is no way out of this paralysis, because in an election year, all these foreign concerns recede to the background. Every issue in the world is going to be filtered and utilized as an American electoral campaign point. And that's very important to understand when trying to understand the possibilities of the West for engaging in diplomacy or even expanding or changing its current military strategy. Everything, as I see it, everything is right now on pause and on hold. The best that can be hoped for by the Ukrainian government, I should say, is some form of aid by the United States. Whether it will be the 60 billion that has been discussed, which is already much reduced from the earlier figure that was discussed in November, or whether it will be a smaller number with many additional caveats and restrictions imposed, is not clear right now. But I can assure our international audience that this is not the primary concern for American politicians today. It is, by contrast, how this will play during the upcoming election season. And the result of this is to really strengthen Russia's hand, because what this means is that for the first time ever, Russia actually has a serious possibility of influencing the outcome of the American elections. The 2016 alleged interference and subsequent efforts attributed to Russia through accounts, through social media accounts, are trivial compared to the ability of Russia today to actually determine, based on its military strategy, whether the Ukraine will suffer a serious defeat on the very eve of the American elections. This is entirely, I think, in the hands of the Russian political and military leadership today, whether they want to push their current advantage at that key moment or not to do so. And this gives them, unfortunately, a great deal of leverage in the American political system.
It will strengthen the hand of the candidates that say we should disengage from Ukraine. Yes.
If it could, it depends what sort of signals Moscow sends behind the scenes.
Yeah.
But if, as a result of a possible Russian counteroffensive, the Ukrainian forces suffer major defeats, that is, of course, going to be used by the Republicans to lay the blame for this debacle at the feet of the Biden administration.
Yeah, well, who would actually who is the one to blame? I mean, I don't see anyone. I don't see somebody else.
Well,
Although
I'll disagree with you a little bit on that. The disaster that is U.S. policy in Ukraine started back many years ago,
true.
and only gathered speed and direction in 2014. At that point, the die was already cast. There was talk about reaching a settlement through the Minsk Accords, but the United States opposed it and encouraged France and Germany to oppose it as well. And ultimately, all the parties involved on the Western side of the Minsk Accords, while paying lip service to those accords, which would have resulted in the reintegration of the Donbas region into Ukraine. Instead, as Merkel and Hollande themselves admitted, they used it merely to build up the Ukrainian military for a potential military assault on Donbas.
Absolutely true. The matter of the fact is that even changes in the White House and in other capitals too, the foreign policy directions of states seems really not to be that much in the hand of the of political agendas and way more in the hand of geopolitical necessity for whatever weird reason. I don't quite understand it, but which though means that even a change in the United States, let's say Donald Trump won the elections, might actually not make things better because the underlying forces are still the same and the underlying heads are still the same. I mean, Victoria Nuland is now, what is she now? A deputy
Undersecretary of State.
Undersecretary of State. But let me ask something else about Russia because I'm more interested in that one. There's one tremendous problem, though, for Russia. Even if they manage to do a big counteroffensive, let's say, even if they manage to take Kiev, and Kiev is not everything. We have about 24 million Galicians in the west of Ukraine, who by now, and I think you told me that last time too, one part of the tragedy of Ukraine is that now the entire system, the entire society is so poisoned against Russia that it's really hard to imagine a reconciliation process. I mean, what would Russia do with 24 million Galicians, even if they were under their control? Do you see that that could be an objective of Russia or not?
I don't think that the occupation of the four Western regions of Ukraine is an objective of the Russian invasion. I don't anticipate them moving forward much more beyond the full capture of the administrative territories of the four disputed regions that where there is now fighting, and not including Crimea. So without going into details, what Putin has said seems to be a logical objective, although difficult to achieve. He has said, for the security of the population of eastern Ukraine and southern Russia now, we need to push back Ukraine's military capacity far enough so that it is not a threat to the people under Russian protection and control. That could be theoretically accomplished in a number of different ways. Part of it would involve territorial acquisition, but I don't think it needs to be a major territorial acquisition. What it would have to involve much more, however, is the destruction of the industrial capacity of Ukraine, which could be turned into military production. with the caveat, however, that Russia's policy on that would change and that it would be willing to accommodate Ukrainian industry if a peace settlement, a long-term peace settlement, were negotiated between Ukraine and Russia. So the offer, as I see it, the logical offer would be Russia initially threatening to invade further and to destroy more of Ukraine's industrial capacity. However, offering not to do so if Ukraine comes to the negotiating table in good faith. The assumption here on the part of Russia is that some Ukrainian leaders, perhaps not the current Ukrainian leadership, but some future Ukrainian leadership, will see that it is not in Ukraine's ultimate interests to be in a perpetual conflict with Russia, and that if it pursues a strategy of perpetual conflict, the West will at some point obviously abandon it. And that will only leave Ukraine worse off.
The problem is that the West has no. The West loves the fact that it can fight a war with Russia without its own troops, that it can, that it the proverbial black Pete card is with Ukraine that does the bleeding and the dying, and the West even has the audacity to say like we are saving Ukraine while utterly completely destroying everything at the fiber and all capacity of that state. So this is why I am so extremely angry. But from a Russian viewpoint, who have obviously given up on trying to come to settle this peacefully. I mean, that's the only thing we know. They gave up on trying to settle it peacefully. They say like, okay, we're going to use force now, and we are in this situation where war is the continuation of politics by other means, and it is still politics though. And the crux for the Russians is that at some point you need a political settlement. This needs this political settlement, but the Europeans of the last 30 years, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, have lied to Russia 5 times a year, again and again and again and again. And I cannot imagine that the current leadership in Russia is inclined to believe anything that's not verifiable and enforceable. So how do you think they will demand that, a verifiable and enforceable settlement?
Which is why I think the logical path toward peace, here's where I disagree with some other analysts. It is not for Russia to negotiate with the West over Ukraine's head. It is indeed to negotiate directly with Ukraine, pointing out to Ukrainians that there is no alternative for the survival of Ukraine but negotiating with Russia directly. And once Ukraine and Russian leaders directly in negotiation achieve a settlement, then that achievement, that settlement, will trump anything the West wants to accomplish. The West will have lost, by virtue of that agreement, all leverage and ability to pressure Ukraine to do what is not in Ukraine's interest, but is only in the West's interest, namely to continue to conduct this war in which the West is not sacrificing its blood and its treasure to the extent certainly that Ukraine is. But what needs to happen is really a sense of awakening in the Ukrainian leadership that in fact the West, while declaring publicly to be fully committed to Ukraine, is in fact not. And they simply need to turn around and look at the past year and a half of actual support, the kind of support that the West has provided, to convince themselves that the West is not pursuing Ukraine's interest in this war, but only its own craven interests.
Yes, and I really like what you laid out, but you're the one who actually explained to me 2 years ago, almost, that the power struggle inside Kiev, inside Ukraine, is really such that it locks in any kind of leadership. It gives much more power to the right wing, to ultra right wing, to the real fascist kind of neo-Nazi types of the Azovs and so on, to threaten that the central government. If you don't follow along, then, well, things will happen. And the other thing is that the current people are so beholden to the West, especially Mr. Zelensky, that I can just not see that. I cannot fathom it. And actually, the Russians say this: we want to negotiate with Ukraine. Well, and they say, like, with another government in Ukraine. So do you see anyone in the internal political process in Ukraine of having two things? At the same time, enough power over the right wingers inside the Ukraine, and the standing with the West to not be called a Putin puppet, to so that if Zelensky has to flee and the West declares him a president in exile, blah 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 blah, and we will never recognize, blah, that would undermine everything, right? What you need is somebody who the West cannot reject. Do you see factions or somebody who has that standing?
What the West labels exile leaders will be irrelevant if the Ukrainian government and the Russian government reach their own settlement in the matter. The exiled Ukrainian government will be as relevant to politics as the exiled Belarus government, which is also somewhere in Brussels or in some Western capital, and is supported nominally, but no one pays any attention to it, especially in the corridors of power in the West. My point, I think, remains that the choice is a difficult one, primarily for Ukrainian nationalists. And I had enough time when writing my book, which was published just before the invasion, or I should say just shortly after the invasion, to think about what it would take for this irreconcilable hostility toward Russia to move toward the need for negotiation, to recognize the need for negotiation. And I simply pointed out that Ukrainian nationalists, even the most hardcore, have in the past made those difficult compromises. They have abandoned their political program when it proved unpalatable to the Western powers, that they were allied with Nazi Germany and hoped for the same type of political regime in a post-war Ukraine. They abandoned that openly, renounced their political ideology in order to obtain political asylum in the West. Now, having come here, they then sometimes proceeded to reconstitute themselves. But again, up until 1991, Ukrainian nationalism was very much a marginal political phenomenon, certainly in the West, and also very much in Ukraine itself, even in Western Ukraine. What changed that was the openness of Ukrainian society once Ukraine had become independent to Western funding. And what turned out to be a very destructive force, because Western Ukrainian nationalists who had settled in the West decided to support political forces within Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, that were extremely divisive and basically caused a rift within the Ukrainian polity between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine. These were two completely different cultures. The differences between them were exacerbated by the type of rhetoric and funding that was provided by Western Ukrainian emigres coming back into Ukraine, and that was then supported as part of the Western policy toward Ukraine. So I think the moment at which Ukrainian nationalists will change their attitude and begin to consider the necessity of negotiating with their worst enemy, which currently is Russia, will come when they recognize that the only alternative to negotiation is the destruction of Ukraine. And so far, at each time when the destruction of Ukraine has become a real possibility after World War II, during the interwar period, when they fought against Poland and allied with Russia to fight against Poland, and throughout Ukrainian history, they have stepped back from self-destruction and realized, trying to play the long game, that they may need to make temporary compromises for the salvation of Ukraine. And I think that is what will ultimately allow for a settlement of this conflict and the rebuilding of Ukrainian society, hopefully in a more compassionate and mutually inclusive fashion.
Yeah, I agree. And in this sense, you know, what we have been saying for the last couple of years still holds true. If Ukraine tomorrow declared unconditionally its neutrality and that it will never seek NATO membership, they would be talking within 2 days with Russia.
Yes, yes, right.
So it's in this sense, it's actually in the hands of Kiev to actually end the slaughter. That's true. Not just in the hands of Moscow, as the West keeps saying all the time.
It's not just Kiev. Well, Kiev, the political establishment in Kiev, we now can visibly see contains multiple different directions, multiple different personalities and aspirations. Someone who at the beginning of 2022 was a close political advisor to Zelensky, Alexei Arestovich, is now in exile and saying exactly the same things that you and I are talking about. So that suggests to me that these ideas are understood in the among Ukrainian politicians. The tricky part at this point is reaching enough of a consensus among enough constituencies to make this part of the possible alternative discourse in society. And a lot has to happen to open up Ukrainian society to the possibility of such alternatives being discussed. The logical way that typically occurs is through military defeat, because you'll recall that Minsk 2, Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 both were accepted by Poroshenko and signed by the Ukrainian government precisely after the devastating defeats of the Ukrainian military in Debaltseve and Ilovaisk.
True. And in this sense, again, the current warfare is still the extension of politics.
Yes.
And, you know, living in a country in Japan that bounced back and had like 70 years of continuous prosperity after giving up, you know, being literally nuked to ashes, giving up and then coming back. I do hope that Ukraine will have a prosperous future, but what it needs, of course, is the will to surrender and then to actually rebuild a good future.
Surrender is a difficult concept to sell right now in Ukraine and in the West. Leaving the West aside, one has to think of the future, not in terms of what we have lost, but the potential to gain much more even than what was lost and to rebuild Ukraine. One of the interesting sub-themes of Ukrainian political discourse throughout the war has been, okay, we are in this existential struggle to survive right now. After we win, however, we will still have to do a lot of soul searching and reform to democratize and make Ukrainian political and financial elites more accountable. That is indeed a theme that can unite all Ukrainians, West and East, reformers, pro-Western, pro-Russian, it doesn't matter. Everyone actually realizes that there is a tremendous need for change within Ukrainian society. And so, without belaboring this point, it is possible, it might be possible to sell not just Ukraine's victory as opening the door to social transformation for the better, but even potentially a Ukrainian defeat as opening the door to a better Ukraine.
And that is definitely something that the Russians need to try to provide, that they need to try to say, like, we will help. We want to help you. Actually, you know, that the Russians keep saying, like, we don't want to destroy Ukraine. We don't want, I mean, we want to help Ukraine. We are a brotherly nation. We are supposed to get along. I have never actually seen a war fought where one side keeps saying you are our brothers.
Yeah.
I do hope that at some point that will arrive.
It certainly won't come from the West.
No.
But there is another constituency that we really don't talk enough about, because we simply assume that at the moment of their incorporation into Russia, they became Russians, fully Russians. But I would remind people that the four eastern regions and Crimea that are currently under Russian control are full of people who are, yes, Russian citizens, but also think of themselves culturally as partly Ukrainian. I mean, this is not a foreign country for them. There are contacts on both sides. And they would very much, on that side of the border, in the former, the territories that are now under Russian jurisdiction, but were formerly part of Ukraine, they would very much like to see close contacts, normal relations reestablished. These are not people that are alien to them. They are very close to them in the border regions. And so I think they are a powerful resource that the Russian government could use to rebuild relations on a people-to-people level in Ukraine, between Ukrainians in the East and Ukrainians in the center and West.
You know, Nicolai, one of the reasons why I really like talking to you is that I always come away from our talks with a better feeling than when we go into, because you constantly distribute hope. So I thank you very much for that, and thank you for your insights today.
Thank you.